The morning Eleanor Whitman bought a jail for $6, the wind off the Indiana cornfields was cold enough to bite through her coat. She stood at the end of a gravel road in Millbrook County, holding 6 crumpled bills in a hand that had not stopped shaking since November. Behind her, the gray stone walls of the abandoned county jail rose 2 stories into a sky the color of old pewter. The bars on the windows were rusted but intact. The roof sagged in 2 places. Weeds grew through the front steps like the building was being slowly returned to the earth. She was 73 years old. She had 35 years of teaching 3rd grade behind her, a marriage of 54 years walking quietly beside her in the form of her husband Walter, and exactly $6 left to her name. 3 weeks ago, she had owned a 4-room house on Barker Street in the town where she had been born. 3 weeks ago, her 3 children had still spoken to her on the telephone. 3 weeks ago, she had not yet learned the thing about Walter that would change every plan she had ever made about how the rest of her life was supposed to go. Walter stood beside her now, hands deep in the pockets of a coat that no longer fit him properly because he had lost weight he did not have to lose. He was looking at the jail the way a carpenter looks at any building, but Eleanor could see something else behind his eyes today. A small distance, a quiet fog, the look of a man who was trying very hard to remember what they were doing here. "Walter," she said softly, "honey, the pastor is waiting." He turned to her, and for one terrible heartbeat she saw nothing in his face. Then it cleared, and he was Walter again. Her Walter, the man who had built her a porch in 1974 and a half bath in 1981 and a new roof every 12 years, whether the old one needed it or not. $6, he said. "You sure about this, Ellie?" "No," she said. "But I'm sure about us." He nodded slow the way a man nods when he is agreeing to a thing he does not entirely understand. He had always trusted her. 42 years of carpentry had taught him to measure twice and cut once, and somewhere along the way he had decided that Eleanor was the measure he trusted most. She handed the $6 to the pastor of the First Methodist Church, a man named Whitfield, who had given them 2 nights on cots in his fellowship hall and the use of his battered Ford Bronco for this trip out to the end of Hadley Road. The pastor folded the bills into an envelope and slid it into his shirt pocket. "You're sure?" Whitfield said. It was not quite a question. Eleanor looked at the jail. She looked at Walter. She looked down the gravel road that ran a mile back to the county highway, and she thought of all the places she could not go anymore. The house on Barker Street, her son Bradford's house where they had stayed for one night before the argument about the cost of a private room at Maplewood Manor, her daughter Marlene's house where her son-in-law had asked her in a tone designed to sound gentle whether they had given any thought to what the long-term plan might be. "I'm sure," she said. But to understand how Eleanor Whitman ended up standing on a gravel road with $6 and an abandoned jail, you have to go back. You have to go back to Millbrook the way it used to be before the children grew up, before the houses on Barker Street started turning over to people who worked in the new offices at the edge of town, before Walter's hands started forgetting where he had set down his level and his pencil and his measuring tape. You have to go back to the 2 of them. Walter Whitman was a carpenter. He had framed houses in 3 counties for 42 years. His hands told the story of every one of them. The knuckles were scarred white from 1,000 small cuts. The palms were calloused into a shape that fit the handle of a hammer, the way a key fits a lock. The left index finger was crooked from a break he had taken in 1981 on a roofing job in Putnam County. a break he had never had set properly because he could not afford to miss the work. He had built his first bookshelf when he was 14 years old, and he had not stopped building since. Eleanor had taught third grade at Millbrook Elementary School for 35 years. She had retired at 60 in the spring of 2013 with a sheet cake and a small ceremony in the gymnasium and a plaque the school had given her that she kept in a drawer. She had been the kind of teacher who learned every child's name by the second day of school. She had bought school supplies with her own money for 35 years. She had stayed late on the days when a child needed someone to stay late, and there had been more of those days than the school district had ever quite acknowledged. They had raised 3 children in the 4-room house on Barker Street. Walter had built the porch himself in the 2nd year of their marriage. Eleanor had hung curtains in every window and kept a kitchen warm enough that the neighbor children had a habit of wandering in for cookies on cold afternoons. They had not been wealthy. They had been the kind of people who stretched a little into enough. The eldest was Bradford. Bradford had been the ambitious one from the time he was old enough to climb. He was the boy who organized the lemonade stand and kept the books and divided the profits unevenly because he had done the work of organizing. By 15, he had decided that Millbrook was too small for him, and by 17, he was already half gone in his own mind. They had refinanced the house to put him through Indiana University. Eleanor had taken on weekend tutoring jobs through the church to cover his books and his room and his meal plan. Walter had worked every overtime shift the Carpenters' Union offered him, and a few that the union didn't know about, and his back had started its long, slow giving out around the time Bradford accepted his first job in commercial real estate development in Indianapolis. Bradford did well. Corner office, new car every 2 years, a house in a suburb whose name Eleanor could never remember with rooms he did not use, and a kitchen that had been remodeled twice. He came home to Millbrook for Christmas most years, and for his mother's birthday in some years, and for his father's in fewer. The middle child was Marlene. Marlene became an accountant. Marlene was the one who called on Sundays mostly. Marlene married a man named Philip Halsey, who sold insurance 2 towns over and who never quite looked Eleanor in the eye when she spoke to him. The youngest was Theodore. Theo went into engineering and moved to Seattle when he was 25, and the calls had grown thinner and thinner over the years, the way a piece of fabric thins where it has been folded too many times. Eleanor and Walter had not complained. They had done what parents do. They had given everything they had so that their children could have more, and their children had more, and that was the thing they had asked for and the thing they had received, and they had not allowed themselves to count up what it had cost them. The first sign came when Walter turned 74. Eleanor noticed it the way you notice a window that has started to stick in its frame. She would find Walter standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning holding the coffee scoop, looking at it as if he had never seen it before. He would ask her on Tuesday what day of the week it was, and again on Wednesday, and twice on Thursday. He started leaving his reading glasses in places where reading glasses had no business being. The freezer, the medicine cabinet, the toolbox in the garage between the chisel and the framing square, as if he had set them down in mid-thought and walked away from himself. She did not say anything to him about it. Walter was proud, and pride was the one thing he had always had in plentiful supply, and a man who has built houses with his own hands for 42 years is not a man who takes kindly to being told that something inside him is starting to come loose. So she watched, and she covered for him. She started writing the grocery lists in larger print and pinning them to the refrigerator. She started reminding him what day his union pension check was due in a voice that was casual enough that he could pretend she was just thinking out loud. She called Bradford one afternoon in the spring of his 75th year. She mentioned it casually, the way you mention weather. She said that Walter had been a little forgetful lately, and that she thought maybe it would be worth looking into some options, and that she was not sure what kind of options were available. She used the word options 3 times in a single conversation because she could not quite bring herself to use any of the words that were closer to the truth. Bradford said he would look into it. Bradford looked into it for 2 years. Then, on a Saturday morning in March, 2 weeks before Walter's 76th birthday, a black SUV pulled into the gravel drive of the house on Barker Street. Bradford got out wearing a wool overcoat and a pair of dress shoes that were entirely wrong for an Indiana march. Marlene got out of the passenger side. Theo had not come. Theo was in Seattle and Theo had not been told. Eleanor was at the kitchen sink when she saw them through the window. She set down the dish she had been washing. She dried her hands on the towel that hung from the oven handle. She watched her son and her daughter walk up the path that Walter had laid in 1982, the year Marlene was born, and she felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still, the way a deer goes quiet when it senses something on the wind. "Walter," she called. "The children are here." Walter came in from the back porch, where he had been working on a small bookcase for the church library. His hands were still dusted with sawdust. He had a smile on his face when he came, in the easy, unforced smile of a man who is glad to see his children. And Eleanor wanted to take that smile and lock it in a drawer and keep it for the rest of her life. Bradford did the talking. He stood in the kitchen where Eleanor had cooked 10,000 meals, and he spoke in the smooth, quiet voice he used with his clients, the voice that made hard things sound reasonable. "We've found a place for you," Bradford said. "It's a nice facility, Maplewood Manor just outside Indianapolis. Very clean, good reviews. A studio apartment for the 2 of you. Meals included." Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the counter. The cup had been part of a set Walter had given her for their 25th anniversary. There were only 3 left of the original 8. "A facility," she said. "It's temporary," Bradford said. "Just until we figure out the house situation. The property taxes went up again last year, and with Dad's medical costs starting to come up, the math just doesn't work." "What math?" Walter asked from the doorway. "The finances, Dad. We've talked about this." They had not talked about this. Bradford had never once sat down at the kitchen table with his parents and gone through their finances. He had received a copy of their tax return the previous spring because Eleanor had asked Marlene for help understanding a line item, and Marlene had forwarded the return to Bradford without asking, and Bradford had built his entire plan on the back of a tax return he had read in 15 minutes on his phone. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Marlene was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes on the linoleum floor that Walter had laid himself in 1989. "Did you know about this?" Eleanor said. Marlene nodded once. She did not speak. "We're not going to a facility," Walter said. His voice had the steady weight of a hammer striking a nail. "Dad," Bradford said, "be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. This is our home. I built half of it with my own hands." Bradford rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was 47 years old, and he had the practiced, exhausted patience of a man who has spent 20 years making other people accept things they did not want to accept. "It's a temporary arrangement," he said. "A few weeks, maybe a month, just until we sort out the house and the taxes and the long-term plan. Eleanor watched her son's face the way she had watched the faces of third graders for 35 years. She knew the geometry of a child telling a half-truth, the eyes that drift just slightly to the side, the smile that arrives a half-second too late, the voice that gets a little smoother where it ought to be rougher. Bradford was lying. Bradford was clearing a problem off his desk. But Walter believed him. Walter, who had never broken a promise in his life, could not imagine that a son of his would break one. So Walter packed 2 suitcases. That was what 42 years of carpentry and 35 years of teaching and 54 years of marriage came down to in the end. 2 suitcases and whatever they could fit inside. Eleanor packed clothes. She packed Walter's reading glasses, 3 pairs, because she knew he would lose 2 of them. She packed her Bible. She packed the wedding photograph from 1972 Walter in a borrowed suit herself in her mother's dress, the 2 of them grinning like they had already won. She packed the small wooden box where Walter kept the receipts from his first job, framed and hung above the workbench in the garage for 40 years, a reminder of where he had started. And then, in a moment that she would think about for the rest of her life, she went into the bathroom alone and opened the medicine cabinet, and she took down the bottles that belonged to Walter, and her hand stopped on the second bottle from the left. It was new. She had not seen it before. The label was made out to Walter Edward Whitman. The dosage was printed in small black type. The name of the medication was a long word she did not entirely recognize, but underneath it in the smaller print was a phrase she did recognize, a phrase that had been in the back of her mind for 2 years now, for the management of mild cognitive impairment. Eleanor stood in the bathroom of the house on Barker Street with the bottle in her hand and her own face in the mirror, and she understood all at once several things she had been refusing to understand. Walter knew. Walter had known for at least 6 months by the date on the prescription. Walter had been seeing a doctor she did not know about, and getting medication she did not know about, and he had been hiding it from her because he had not wanted to put a name on the thing that was happening to him, the dishonor of it, the lonely pride of it. 42 years of building things that would hold, and now the only thing left to build was a wall between himself and the wife he loved, so that she would not have to see the foundation cracking underneath him. Eleanor put the bottle back in the cabinet. She closed the cabinet door. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman in the mirror was 73 years old. The woman in the mirror had taught 3rd grade for 35 years and raised 3 children and stood beside Walter through every joy and every reversal of 54 years, and the woman in the mirror was about to have to become something she had not yet been. She took the bottle. She slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She did not say a word. Bradford drove them to a motel off the interstate, the Pine View Motor Lodge with a neon sign missing 2 letters and a parking lot full of potholes. He carried their suitcases to the curb. He told them he would call within the week. He did not call within the week. Eleanor watched him drive away in the black SUV. Marlene did not look back through the rear window. The taillights crested a small rise in the road, and then they were gone, and Walter put a hand on Eleanor's elbow, and the wind off the highway was cold, and she had a bottle of medication in her coat pocket that her husband did not know she knew about. The room at the Pine View smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarette smoke. The heater rattled but worked. The television had 3 channels and only one of them came in clearly. Walter sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands, and Eleanor sat down next to him and took those hands in hers and held them. Bradford said a few weeks. Walter said, I know. He'll call. I know. She did not believe it, but she did not say so. There is no point in arguing with hope when hope is the only thing your husband is holding on to. The first 3 days at the Pine View were the days of pretending. Walter pretended that this was a temporary thing. Eleanor pretended that she had not seen the bottle in the medicine cabinet. They walked across the parking lot to the gas station and bought bread and peanut butter, and Walter joked that it was like camping, and Eleanor laughed at the joke because what else was she going to do? On the 4th day, Eleanor tried Bradford on the prepaid phone she had bought at the gas station. She got his voicemail. She tried him again on the 5th day. Voicemail. She tried Marlene on the 6th day. Marlene picked up and there was a long silence, and Marlene said she was at work and would call back, and she did not call back. Eleanor tried Theo. The number had been disconnected. She did not know when. She did not know why. By the 8th day, she had counted their money on the back of a gas station receipt. They had $192. The motel was $39 a night. She did the math twice the way Walter would have done it. 5 days. Maybe 6 if they ate less. She did not tell Walter the number. On the 9th day, Walter forgot her name. It was a small thing. He looked at her across the motel room with a question in his eyes, and the question was not the question of a husband, but the question of a stranger. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he was Walter again, and he was asking her if she wanted him to walk over to the gas station for coffee, and the moment passed as if it had not happened. Eleanor went into the motel bathroom and turned on the shower so he would not hear her, and she sat down on the edge of the tub, and she put her face in her hands, and she did not cry. She had not cried since the day Bradford drove them away, and she was not going to start now. She sat there for 10 minutes with the water running, and when she came out of the bathroom, Walter was sitting on the bed watching the one television channel that came in clearly, and he smiled at her, and she smiled back, and she made a decision. She was not going to wait for Bradford to call. She was not going to wait for anyone to call. She was going to walk into the county office building 2 blocks from the church where Whitfield was, and she was going to find a place that they could afford because the money was going to run out in 3 days, and she was the only one of the 2 of them who was going to be able to do this thing now. Walter did not know it yet. But Walter had at some point in the last 6 months quietly handed her the toolbox, and Eleanor was going to have to learn how to use it. The next morning she put on her coat. She took the $17 she had set aside for the bus, and she walked to the highway, and she rode the county shuttle into Millbrook, and she walked the 4 blocks from the courthouse stop to the Millbrook County Recorder's office. The office was on the 2nd floor. There was a young woman behind the records counter. She had pale hair cut very short and rimless glasses, and a small silver pin on her sweater in the shape of a bird. Her nameplate said, Cordelia Hartwell. "I need to find a place to live," Eleanor said. She had practiced the sentence in her head on the bus ride in. It came out sounding smaller than she had wanted. "My husband and I, we have almost no money. I need to know what's available." Cordelia Hartwell looked up at her. She looked at Eleanor for what was probably only 3 seconds, but Eleanor had spent 35 years reading the faces of children, and she knew the difference between 3 seconds of standard customer service and 3 seconds of something else. Cordelia was looking at her the way you look at a person you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. "Tell me your situation," Cordelia said. So Eleanor told her. She told her about Bradford and the SUV and the Pine View. She told her about the motel bill and the disconnected phone number in Seattle. She did not tell her about the bottle in her coat pocket. There were some things that still belonged only to her and to Walter. Cordelia listened. She did not interrupt. When Eleanor was done, Cordelia turned to her computer and typed for a long minute, and then she stopped typing and looked at the screen for a longer minute, and then she said in a voice that had gone quiet in a way that Eleanor would think about for a long time afterward. "There's a tax sale property. It's been sitting for years. Nobody wants it. $6. $6, Eleanor said. That's the minimum the county is allowed to accept. It's been listed at that price since 2009. What is it? Cordelia hesitated. Then she said, It's the old Millbrook County Jail, about 12 miles east of town off Hadley Road. It hasn't been used since 1993. It's been listed as uninhabitable since 1997. Is it standing? It's standing. That's about all I can tell you about it. Eleanor was already pulling the $6 from her purse, but Cordelia was reaching for something else. She had bent down behind the counter, and now she straightened up, and she had a thin gray accordion folder in her hands. She set it on the counter between them. Mrs. Whitman, Cordelia said, before you decide, there's something I think you should look at. The folder was the historical occupancy record for the jail. The last 20 years, it had operated from 1973 to 1993. Names, dates, charges, the kind of record a county keeps and forgets it has kept. Cordelia opened the folder to a page near the back. She turned it around on the counter so Eleanor could read it. There was a name on the page, a booking date in October of 1991. The name was James Sutton, age 21, charged with felony breaking and entering. Eleanor stared at the name. She had taught a third grader named Jimmy Sutton in the spring of 1978, her first year in the classroom. He had been a small, quiet boy with a stutter that came out worst in math. His mother had been a single mother who worked 2 shifts at the cannery in Tipton. Jimmy had not been a good student in any obvious way, but Jimmy had loved books in the slow, careful way that some children love books, and Eleanor had spent an hour after school 3 days a week for an entire year reading with him until the stutter loosened and the words came easier. She had lost track of him after 5th grade. The Sutton family had moved. She had wondered sometimes in the way a teacher wonders about a child who passes through her classroom and disappears into the rest of the world. Jimmy Sutton had been in this jail. Cordelia was watching her face. Keep reading, Cordelia said gently. There was a notation at the bottom of Jimmy's intake page. A note in different handwriting dated 3 weeks after his booking in pencil that had faded to almost nothing. Inmate requested mailing address for E. Whitman, Millbrook Elementary. Letter not sent. Held in personal effects upon transfer. Cordelia slid a small yellowed envelope across the counter. The envelope was sealed. It had Eleanor's name on the front in a careful penciled hand that had clearly worked hard to make every letter right. My grandfather was the last sheriff who ran that jail, Cordelia said. Sheriff Hartwell. He died 4 years ago. Before he died, he asked me to make sure this got to the right person, if the right person ever came in here looking. He said it was the only piece of mail he ever held back in 40 years on the job because he thought the boy might want to send it himself when he got out. The boy never came back to get it. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She picked up the envelope. She did not open it there. She slid it into her purse next to her wedding photograph. She paid the $6. Cordelia gave her a key. The key was iron and old, the kind of key that fit a lock that had been turned by hand for 60 years. Mrs. Whitman, Cordelia said as Eleanor turned to go. My grandfather always said something about that building. He said it was waiting. Waiting for what? He never said. I don't think he knew. He just said someday the right person was going to walk in there and the building would know. The pastor drove them out to the jail that afternoon, 12 miles east of town, past the cornfields and the leaning fence posts, until the paved road ended and the gravel began. The gravel went on for another mile, narrowing until the trees opened up and the building came into view. Walter got out of the Bronco slowly. He stood in the gravel and looked at the jail, and Eleanor watched him, and she could see the carpenter in him taking over from the man. He was not seeing the ruin. He was seeing the bones. "Limestone foundation," he said. "That's why it's still standing. They built these to last." Eleanor walked up the front steps. The chain across the door hung loose. The padlock had rusted open. She put her hand on the door, and the door swung inward on hinges that creaked but held, and the cold, dim air of a building that had been closed for 30 years rolled out around her. The corridor stretched ahead, 12 cells, 6 on each side, iron bars floor to ceiling. The processing desk near the entrance still held a faded notice from 1993. There was a staircase at the back leading up to a second floor. She walked to the nearest cell and put her hand on the bars. The iron was cold. The space inside the cell was about 8 feet by 10. The walls were stone. The ceiling was solid. A narrow barred window let in a slant of late afternoon light. Walter came up beside her. "Walls are dry," she said. "Floors level. Roof's intact. It's a jail, Ellie. It's $6, Walter, and it's ours." He was quiet for a long time. Then he put his hand on the bars next to hers, and he tested the iron the way a man tests anything he is thinking of trusting his weight to. Solid, bolted into stone, not going anywhere. "We raised 3 children in a 4-room house," she said. "I remember. I think we can manage a few jail cells." He looked at her. 42 years of marriage, and she could still surprise him. He did not smile, but something in his face softened, and he nodded once, and that was enough. They spent that first night in the cell closest to the front entrance. Walter wedged the outer door shut with a piece of wood he found in a storage closet. Eleanor folded her coat into a pillow. They had no electricity, no running water, no heat. The November air came through the broken windows and settled into everything. Walter fell asleep first. He fell asleep faster than he had been falling asleep in months, which surprised her because she had thought a concrete floor would be the end of him. But Walter had spent a lifetime working until his body could not hold a tool anymore, and the body knew how to take rest where it could find it. Eleanor lay awake. She listened to the wind moving through the corridor, rattling loose things, making the building moan. It was the sound of an old building settling around new occupants, not welcoming exactly, but not hostile, just waiting. After a while, when she was sure Walter was deeply asleep, she sat up. She took the envelope from her purse. She held it for a long time. Then she unsealed it slowly, the way you open something that has been waiting a long time to be read. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a careful penciled hand on lined paper. It was dated the 11th of November, 1991. "Dear Mrs. Whitman," it began. "You probably do not remember me. My name is Jimmy Sutton, and I was in your 3rd grade class in 1978. Eleanor read the letter twice. The first time she read it, her hand was steady. The second time, it was not. Jimmy had written to her from this cell. He had written to her because he had needed someone to know that he had not turned out the way he should have, and he had not been able to think of anyone to tell, and at the bottom of all the wrong turns and the bad company and the broken windows of his life, the only person he could think of who had ever looked him in the eye and told him he was capable of more was a woman who had read books with him after school for 1 year when he was 8 years old. The last paragraph was 4 sentences long. I wanted to tell you that I remember. I remember the way you said my name. You were the only one who ever said it like it was a name worth saying. If I get out of here, I am going to try to be the kind of man you thought I could be. The letter was signed Jimmy. Eleanor folded the letter back along its creases. She slid it back into the envelope. She sat in the dark of the cell with Walter's slow breathing beside her and the November wind moving through the bars of the window, and she thought about a small, quiet boy with a stutter who had loved books, and she thought about the building she was sitting in. She thought about what Cordelia's grandfather had said. The building had been waiting. She did not know yet what it had been waiting for, but she knew sitting there in the dark that she was no longer afraid of it. The bars on the windows did not feel like bars anymore. They felt like a frame around a window that did not yet have anything to look out at. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she got up. She moved quietly so as not to wake Walter. She went to her suitcase and unzipped the lining. The lining was burgundy fabric, a cheap synthetic, the kind they put inside cheap luggage. She took her sewing scissors from the side pocket and cut the lining free in a long strip about 2 feet wide and 5 feet long. She tied one end of the fabric to the iron bar at the left side of the cell window. She stretched it taut across the window and tied the other end to the bar on the right. She stepped back. The fabric caught the moonlight and glowed faintly against the cold iron. It was not a curtain, not really, but it was the start of one. "There," she said softly to no one. "Now it's a window." She lay back down beside Walter. She took his hand. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 11 nights, she slept. Walter woke before her at dawn. She heard him moving slow and careful, the way he moved when he did not want to wake her. She kept her eyes closed and listened. She heard him cross the cell to the doorway. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, slow at first, then steadier. She heard him stop somewhere down the hall. She heard him stand still for a long time. When she finally got up and went out into the corridor, she found him at the far end, standing in front of one of the empty cells, looking at it the way he used to look at a job site before the first day of framing. "Bones are good," he said without turning around. "I can work with this." "I know you can." He turned. He looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen in months, a focus, a quietness, the mind of a man who had a problem to solve and who had solved problems for a living for 42 years. The medication was in her coat pocket. The decline was still coming. She knew that. She had read enough at the library that morning 2 weeks ago while Walter had been at the doctor. He had not told her he was seeing to know what the road in front of them was going to look like. But this morning in this corridor, in this building that had been waiting for them, Walter was Walter, and Eleanor was going to take every morning of that she could get. "What do you need?" she said. "Tools," he said, "and a way to pay for them. I'll figure it out." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow. The nod of a man who had spent 54 years deciding that Eleanor was the measure he trusted most. The first stranger came on the 3rd day. His name was Hollis Bramwell. He was 75 years old. He drove an old red Chevrolet pickup with a dented tailgate, and he wore a heavy canvas coat that was old enough to have softened to the color of bread crust. He pulled into the gravel turnaround in front of the jail and got out and stood for a minute with his hand on the open door of the truck, looking at the building. Eleanor came out onto the front steps. Hollis Bramwell took off his cap. He had thick white hair and a face that had been weathered into deep lines around the eyes by 30 years of running into burning buildings. He had retired from the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department 4 years ago. His hands were stiff in the cold. He had buried a son in the spring of 1985, and he had not been the same man afterward, and he had been waiting for 38 years for a way to lay that down. "Mrs. Whitman," he said. His voice was hoarse. "I don't know if you remember me." Eleanor looked at him. She did not. She had taught 742 children in 35 years, and she had remembered every one of their names while they were in her classroom, but she had not remembered every parent who had stood in a doorway at parent-teacher night. "My boy was Daniel," he said. "He was in your 3rd grade class, the spring of 1982. She remembered. She remembered Daniel Bramwell, a red-haired boy who had loved trains and who had drawn the same locomotive over and over on every piece of art paper she gave him. She remembered him because he had died. She remembered him because in the spring of 1985, when he was 11 years old, he had been struck by a delivery truck on the corner of Maple and 6th, 3 blocks from the elementary school, and the news had reached her at the grocery store, and she had left her cart in the aisle and driven straight to the hospital, and she had sat in the waiting room with Hollis Bramwell and his wife for 6 hours, and she had been the one who held his wife's hand when the doctor came out and said he was sorry. "I remember Daniel," she said. Hollis Bramwell put his cap back on. He looked down at the gravel. "You came to the funeral," he said. "I know you came. I didn't say much to you that day. I wasn't saying much to anybody. You don't have to. I owe you a debt, Mrs. Whitman. I have owed you a debt for 38 years. I heard at the diner last night that you and your husband bought this place for $6. He looked up at her. "I have come to pay what I owe." He stayed all morning. He looked at every cell. He looked at the wiring and the plumbing and the roof. He stood with Walter for an hour in the upstairs corridor, the two of them talking quiet and slow about the structure of a building, 2 old craftsmen sizing up a problem. Walter that morning was sharp. Walter that morning was the man he had been 5 years ago. Eleanor watched them from the bottom of the stairs, and she did not let herself cry because she had not yet earned the right to cry, and there was still too much work to do. When Hollis Bramwell drove away that afternoon, he left behind an iron toolbox with a full set of carpenter's hand tools. He left behind a coiled length of electrical wire. He left behind 2 50-pound bags of joint compound. He left behind a folded piece of paper with 3 names and 3 phone numbers on it, and a single line written in a careful, blocky hand. "These men will help. I have already called them." The town began to find them after that. It found them slowly. A farmer left a sack of potatoes on the front step. A woman from the diner drove out with a box of canned goods. The pastor brought a propane camp stove. A retired electrician named Henry came on the 4th day and spent a week running line from the utility pole at the edge of the property, which still had a live connection. Nobody had bothered to disconnect. A retired plumber named Samuel came on the 5th day and got cold water running to 1 bathroom by the 8th. Walter, on his good days, worked alongside them. On his harder days, he sat in the corridor and watched, and sometimes he gave directions that did not quite make sense, and Henry and Samuel never corrected him. They just said, "Yes, Walt," and they kept working, and they finished the day's work the way Walter would have finished it. Eleanor cooked over the camp stove and washed clothes in the well water Hollis had taught her to draw, and she watched her husband forget slowly, in small pieces, the names of the tools he had used for 42 years. She did not tell anyone about the medication. She did not tell anyone about the letter from Jimmy Sutton. She did not tell anyone about the way Walter had stood in the kitchen of the motel on the 9th day and looked at her like a stranger. She just kept the schedule. She kept the meals. She kept the home the way she had kept her classroom, the way she had kept everything for 35 years. She kept it because that was what she had always done, and because if she stopped keeping it, she did not know what would happen. Then, on a cold Tuesday evening in early December, 6 weeks after they had moved in, Delilah arrived. Eleanor heard the footsteps on the gravel first. Slow, uneven steps. The walk of someone who had been walking longer than they should have been walking. She set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir a pot of soup, and she dried her hands on a towel, and she went out to the front entrance. There was a young woman on the steps. She could not have been more than 25. She was very thin except for the curve of her belly under a coat that was too light for the weather 6 months along by Eleanor's quick, experienced count. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose. She had a backpack over one shoulder. Her right hand was resting on her stomach in a way that was half protective and half tired, the way a woman's hand rests on a pregnancy that is not as joyful as it ought to be. But it was not the pregnancy that Eleanor saw first. It was the bruise. The bruise was along the young woman's jawline. It was fading from purple to yellow. A week old, maybe more. The kind of bruise that comes from a hand, not from a fall. Eleanor had taught 3rd grade for 35 years. She had seen this bruise on the faces of mothers at parent-teacher night more times than she would ever have wanted to count. "My car died," the young woman said. "About a mile back on the road. I saw the light and I didn't know where else to go." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. Eleanor opened the door wider. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold out there." "I don't want to intrude. I just need a phone." "I have soup," Eleanor said. "Come in." The young woman hesitated. She looked past Eleanor down the corridor at the stone walls and the converted cells and the warm light coming from the kitchen. "Is this a jail? It used to be. What is it now?" Eleanor thought about that. She thought about it for longer than the answer required. "It's a home," she said. "Come sit down." Her name was Delilah. She did not give a last name, and Eleanor did not ask. She sat at the kitchen table that Walter had built from salvaged lumber, and she ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 pieces of bread, and she answered the questions Eleanor asked her with short, careful sentences. She was 25. She was 6 months pregnant. She was not going home. She did not have family that she could go back to, of the kind you could go back to. She had been driving north out of Indianapolis for 2 days, sleeping in her car with no real plan beyond the gas left in her tank. Walter came in from the 2nd floor, where he had been working with Henry. He looked at Delilah, and he looked at Eleanor, and he went and got another bowl from the shelf and set it in front of Delilah without saying anything, and Eleanor loved her husband. Then, in a way she had not loved him in months. Delilah ate the 3rd bowl slowly. Then she set down her spoon. "Why are you being kind to me?" she said. "You don't know me." Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over Delilah's. "Because somebody should," she said. Delilah stayed that night in the cell 2 doors down from Eleanor and Walter's. She was still there the next morning and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, Walter, on a good day, had built her a low bed frame with a step at the side for her to climb in and out of without straining her belly. Eleanor had hung a piece of fabric across her window that matched the one across her own. It was on the 4th night very late that Delilah told her. Eleanor was in the kitchen washing the last of the dinner dishes. The building was quiet. Walter was asleep. Hollis had gone home hours ago. Delilah came into the kitchen in her socks. She had been crying. She did not try to hide it. "Eleanor," she said, "I have to tell you something." Eleanor set down the dish towel. "My husband's name is Garrett," Delilah said. "He's a developer, commercial real estate. He works out of an office in downtown Indianapolis." She paused. Her hand moved to her belly. "He's not a good man. I think you have probably guessed that part." Eleanor nodded slow. "There's something else," Delilah said. "I don't know if it matters. I almost didn't tell you. But I have been lying awake the last 3 nights thinking about it, and I can't keep it inside anymore." She took a breath. "Garrett's company has been buying up abandoned county properties in rural Indiana for the last 2 years. Tax sale lots, old schoolhouses, closed-up community centers. He buys them cheap and sits on them and waits for the county to expand. He has a partner. They go in on the deals together." Eleanor's hands had gone very cold. "The partner's name is Bradford Whitman." Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She sat down because her legs had decided to sit down without consulting her. 6 months ago. Delilah said, "I was at a dinner with Garrett. Bradford was there. They were talking about a property they had been watching for a long time, an old county jail 12 miles outside a town called Millbrook on a road called Hadley. Bradford said the asking price was $6, and the only reason nobody had bought it was because the county hadn't bothered to push it. He said he was waiting for the right time." The kitchen was very quiet. "Bradford said he was working on something on the family side that would clear the way," Delilah said. "He didn't say what it was, but he said by November he would have the property in the family. He said it like it was already done." Eleanor looked at her hands on the kitchen table. The table Walter had built from salvaged lumber. The table she had eaten breakfast at this morning with her husband, who was upstairs sleeping, who had buried half of himself already in the long, slow way that Alzheimer's buries a man. She understood then several things at once. Bradford had not abandoned them by accident. Bradford had not been overwhelmed by the math. Bradford had known about the jail before Eleanor had ever heard of it. Bradford had calculated with the cold, patient smoothness he used on all his deals that the surest way to get his parents out of the way of his plans was to put them in a place from which they would not return, and to wait, and that what came next would take care of itself. He had not counted on Eleanor. He had counted on Walter, the man who trusted him, the man whose mind was already starting to slip. He had not counted on the fact that Walter, somewhere in the last 6 months, had quietly handed Eleanor the toolbox. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, and she did not say anything for a long time. Delilah waited. Outside, the December wind moved through the bars on the windows, and the long burgundy curtain Eleanor had cut from her suitcase stirred gently in the draft. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was steady. She was surprised to hear how steady it was. "Go to bed, Delilah. We will talk in the morning." Delilah went. Eleanor stayed at the table. She sat until the soup pot was cold and the moon had moved past the window, and the building had gone fully quiet around her. And then she stood up, and she put on her coat, and she walked out the front door of the jail and into the cold gravel turnaround. She stood there in the dark and the cold, and she looked up at the stars over the Indiana cornfields, and she said one thing out loud in the quiet voice of a woman who has spent 35 years knowing exactly what to say to a child who has done something wrong. "All right, Bradford," she said. "All right, son." Then she walked back inside. She closed the door behind her. The next morning, 2 more things happened in the space of an hour. The first was that an old man in a faded brown coat came up the gravel road on foot. He had walked the last 3 miles. His name was Edward. He was 81 years old. His wife had died 2 years ago, and the medical bills had taken the house, and he had been sleeping in his car in the parking lot of the Methodist Church for 3 months, and Pastor Whitfield had finally told him about the jail. Eleanor met him on the steps, and she did not ask him any questions. She showed him to a cell on the first floor, the one closest to the kitchen, and she told him the bed was his for as long as he needed it. The second thing happened 20 minutes later. A county vehicle came up the gravel road. A man got out with a clipboard. He came up the steps and handed Eleanor a sealed envelope. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She had seen the seal of the Millbrook County Code Enforcement Office before. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table while Edward ate his first bowl of soup, and Delilah dried the dishes, and Walter stood at the sink looking out the window with the slightly puzzled expression he wore on the harder mornings. The letter was 1 page. The county was issuing a 30-day inspection notice. The building had been listed as uninhabitable since 1997. Code enforcement would arrive on the morning of the 31st day to assess the structure for compliance. Failure to meet code on every measure would result in immediate condemnation and demolition. Eleanor folded the letter. She set it on the table. She looked at Walter. She looked at Delilah. She looked at Edward. She thought of Bradford in his office in Indianapolis with his black SUV in the parking garage and his wool overcoat on the hook behind the door, waiting patiently for what he believed was already his. She thought of the building around her, the building that had been waiting. "All right," she said to no one and to everyone. "All right." Outside, the December wind moved through the bars on the windows, and the burgundy curtains stirred in the draft, and the long road from the courthouse to the gravel turnaround went on being a road, and the building that used to be a jail went on being something else, something that did not yet have a name, but that had 30 days now to prove that it deserved to keep on being it. The 30 days began on a Wednesday morning in early December, with the wind coming down off the Indiana cornfields and the sky the color of beaten lead. Eleanor stood at the long kitchen table that Walter had built from salvaged lumber, and she made a list on the back of a brown paper grocery bag, the way she had made lesson plans for 35 years. She wrote in the careful printing she had used to write spelling words on a chalkboard. Electrical to code on the second floor, plumbing to the upstairs bathroom, window glass replaced in 7 openings, fire egress on both floors, smoke detectors in every cell, carbon monoxide detectors near the wood stove, handrails reinforced, stair treads patched. The list ran down the side of the bag and onto a second bag and finally onto a third. 23 items. She set the lists on the table and stood looking at them for a long minute. Then she pinned them to the wall above the stove with a single nail Walter had driven in for her the week before, and she went out to the front entrance and rang the small brass school bell that Hollis Bramwell had brought out the day before from his late wife's collection. The sound of it carried clear and high across the gravel turnaround. Walter came out of the workshop where he had been sanding a piece of pine with slow, steady strokes. Delilah came out of the cell where she had been folding blankets. Edward came up from the well pump where he had been priming it for the morning. They gathered on the steps in the cold, and Eleanor stood above them on the top step with her grocery bag lists in her hand, and she spoke to them the way she had spoken to a classroom of third graders on the first morning of every September for 35 years. She told them about the inspection. She told them about the 30 days. She did not tell them about Bradford. She did not yet tell them about the conversation Delilah had given her at the kitchen table 4 nights ago. There would be time for that. There would be time for everything. But this morning, what was needed was a schedule and a job for every pair of hands, and Eleanor Whitman knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had run a classroom of 25 8-year-olds for 35 Septembers, how to give a job to every pair of hands. "We have 30 days, she said. "We are going to use every one of them." She gave the assignments. Walter would oversee the carpentry. He would not be alone. Hollis Bramwell would be on the property by 8 every morning, and Hollis would do the work that Walter's hands could no longer quite do, but Walter would call the cuts. Henry would finish the second-floor wiring. Samuel would take the upstairs plumbing. Delilah would handle the inside work, the cleaning and the painting and the curtains, and Edward would manage the supplies in the kitchen and the meals. She did not say what she would do herself. They would find out. They went back inside. The first week was the easy week. Hollis arrived on the morning of the second day with 2 more men. The first was a retired pipe fitter named Otis, who had grown up 2 farms over from Hollis. The second was a man named Roland, 68 years old, a Finnish carpenter who had worked alongside Walter on a half-dozen jobs in the 80s and 90s, and who had heard about the jail at the diner the previous Saturday. Roland came up the gravel road in a battered Ford F250 with a full set of finish tools in the bed and a thermos of coffee on the dashboard, and he walked up to Walter on the front steps and shook his hand and said only one thing. "Walt." "I heard." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Eleanor watched her husband's face, the slow, careful work of recognition that was harder for him now than it used to be. Then Walter's face cleared, and he smiled, the old easy smile, and he said, "Roland, you old bastard." Roland laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had been afraid of what he might find when he came up the gravel road, and who had found the friend he remembered after all. That evening at the kitchen table, when the men had gone home and Walter had gone to bed early because he was tired from the day Eleanor sat with Delilah and Edward, and she told them about Bradford. She told them about the dinner Delilah had described. She told them about the property being on Bradford's list before any of them had ever heard of it. She told them what she had understood sitting at this same table 4 nights ago about why Bradford had driven them to the Pineview Motor Lodge. Edward listened. His hands were folded around a cup of tea. When she was done, he looked up at her, and his old eyes were clear and steady. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, "what is your son's full name?" "Bradford Edgar Whitman." Edward nodded. "I am 81 years old. I have lived in Millbrook County my entire life. I worked for Tipton Savings and Loan for 42 years before they closed the branch and I retired. I knew everybody in this county who ever borrowed $1 between 1962 and 2004. He paused. I do not know your son, but I know how men like him work. They work in patience. They work in distance. The distance is the most important part. They do not want to be in the room when the thing they have set in motion happens. They want to be in another city, in another county, on another phone call when the building falls down. He set his teacup down. You are going to have to make him be in the room, Mrs. Whitman. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at this old man who had walked 3 miles up a gravel road 4 days ago with everything he owned in a single duffel bag, and she understood that Edward had not come to the jail by accident any more than Hollis had, any more than Delilah had, any more than she and Walter had themselves. The building had been waiting. The building had been waiting for all of them. Finn arrived on the morning of the 8th day. He was 17 years old, and he came up the gravel road on foot, with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a hooded sweatshirt that was not warm enough for the December morning. He stopped at the end of the gravel and stood looking at the building for nearly an hour before he came up the steps. Delilah saw him first. She came and got Eleanor. Eleanor went out onto the steps. The boy was thin, with dark hair cut short, and a face that had been recently cleaned of something, the way a face gets cleaned when a person has decided they do not want anyone to know what it has been through. "Are you Mrs. Whitman?" he said. "I am." "They said at the diner that you take people in." "We have rooms," she said, "if you need one." "I don't have any money." "Nobody here does." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved his hair. He had the look in his eyes that Eleanor had seen over 35 years, in the eyes of children who had walked into her classroom on the first day of school carrying something they had not yet figured out how to put down. "My father told me to leave," Finn said, 3 weeks ago. He said I was not the son he raised. He said I was not welcome in his house. He did not say what he had told his father. He did not have to. Eleanor had read the faces of children for 35 years, and she had read the faces of fathers for nearly as long, and she did not need a paragraph to fill in what the boy was not saying. "What is your name?" "Finn. Finn Adelard." "Come inside, Finn. There is soup." She showed him to a cell on the 2nd floor, the one nearest the new fire escape Walter and Hollis had begun to weld in place the week before. He set his duffel on the bed. He stood looking at the stone walls and the barred window and the small wooden shelf Walter had nailed to the wall. "This was a jail cell," he said. "It was. It feels safer than where I have been sleeping." "That is the idea," Eleanor said. She left him to settle in. She went back down the stairs slowly because the stairs were getting harder for her in the cold, and she went to the kitchen and set a 4th place at the table for supper. Walter was in the kitchen when she came in. He was standing at the counter with a coffee cup in his hand, looking at the cup as if he was not entirely certain how it had gotten there. Eleanor watched him for a moment from the doorway. Then she crossed to him and put her hand on his arm. "Walter." He turned. There was a bead of nothing in his eyes. Then she came back into focus, and he smiled the slow, soft smile of a man returning from a small distance. And he said, "Ellie, I know. Was I going to do something?" "You were going to drink your coffee." He looked down at the cup. He nodded. He took a slow, careful sip. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway because Walter had spent 42 years finishing what he had started, and the body remembered even when the mind grew quiet. She did not tell him about Finn yet. She did not tell him about Bradford. She did not tell him about the inspection, which was now 22 days away and counting. She had been keeping more and more of the building from him in small, careful pieces, the way you keep a hard winter from a child by pulling the curtains shut at 4 in the afternoon. She did not enjoy it, but she had become good at it the way she had become good at the toolbox. There were things she had not asked to learn, but she had learned them because no one else was going to. That night she labeled the kitchen. She did it after Walter had gone to bed. She used the masking tape and a black marker she had found in a kitchen drawer. She wrote coffee on a piece of tape and stuck it to the cabinet where the coffee was. She wrote sugar and stuck it next to it. She wrote spoons on the drawer. She wrote oatmeal on the cabinet over the sink. She wrote bread on the box on the counter. When she had finished, she stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at it. The kitchen of a woman who had cooked 10,000 meals in another house in another life now had labels on every surface written in the careful printing she had once used to write spelling words on a chalkboard for children who could not yet spell. She went to bed. She lay next to Walter. He was already deeply asleep. She listened to his breathing, the slow, even breathing of a man who had worked with his hands all day in a building he loved, and she put her hand on his chest, and she let herself close her eyes. Vincent arrived on the 11th day. He came in a clean gray Buick sedan that did not belong on a gravel road. He parked at the turnaround and got out wearing slacks and a flannel shirt that had the sharp creases of a flannel shirt that had been bought new the day before. He carried a small leather duffel. He had a clean-shaven face, a soft middle, and the kind of hands that had never held a tool that was older than the person holding it. He told Eleanor at the door that his name was Vincent Pell. He said he had been an accountant in Indianapolis. He said he had lost his job in the spring and his apartment in the summer, and he had been moving between a brother's basement and his car for 3 months. He said the diner had told him about the jail. He said it all with a small, careful smile. Eleanor, who had spent 35 years reading the faces of children who had not done their homework, knew within 90 seconds that the man was lying. She did not let it show. She showed him to a cell on the 2nd floor on the opposite end of the corridor from Finn. She gave him a clean blanket. She told him that supper was at 6 and that he was expected to help with whatever he could help with, and she went back down the stairs and into the kitchen and stood at the sink for a full minute with her hands flat on the counter, breathing slowly. She went to find Edward. Edward was in the storage closet organizing the donations that had come in over the past week. He looked up when she came in. He read her face. He set down the can of beans he had been about to shelve. "Visitor," he said. "Yes." "Tell me," she told him. She told him about the clean Buick and the new flannel shirt and the soft hands. She told him about the smile. She told him that the man had said 3 things that did not quite line up, and that the lie had been in the small spaces between the things he had said. Edward listened the whole way through. When she was done, he was quiet for a long minute. "Mrs. Whitman," he said finally, "I am 81 years old. I sat across a desk from men who were lying to me about loan applications for 42 years. I will tell you something I learned in the first 10 years and never unlearned. The way you catch a lie is not by asking better questions. It is by giving the liar a small piece of something they want and then watching what they do with it." Eleanor looked at him. "What does this man want?" Edward said. "He wants to know what we have," she said slowly. "He wants to know what is happening here." "Then give him something to find," Edward said. "Something he will not be able to keep his hands off." She thought about that. That night, after Vincent had gone to bed, Eleanor went into the small office at the back of the booking room where she kept the donations log and the expense receipts. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. She took out a manila envelope. She wrote across the front of it in heavy black marker and handwriting that was slightly trembling in the way an old woman's handwriting trembles when she is hiding something. Donations cash. Do not move. Inside the envelope, she placed $200 in cash. 150 of it was real money that had been donated the week before. The other 50 was play money she had taken out of a board game in the kitchen cabinet where Hollis had brought a box of board games for the long winter evenings. She had aged the play money by rubbing it lightly between her fingers and folding it into the stack of real bills. She placed the envelope at the back of the drawer. Then she set the small, pocket-sized cassette recorder she had found in the bottom of one of her teaching boxes, a recorder she had used in 1989 to record student reading exercises, on the top of the bookshelf above the desk. She pressed record. She closed the office door. She went to bed. In the morning before breakfast, she went back into the office. The cassette recorder was still on the shelf. The tape had run out at some point in the night. She rewound it. She closed the office door behind her, and she locked it with the small key she had been keeping in her apron pocket. She did not listen to the tape that morning. She wanted Edward in the room when she did. Edward came in after breakfast. The two of them sat at the small desk together. She pressed play. For the first 40 minutes, the tape was silence. The hum of the empty room, the soft creak of the building settling in the cold. Then, at minute 43, there was the sound of the office door opening. Footsteps. The slow, careful footsteps of a man who was trying very hard not to be heard. The squeak of a desk drawer being slid open. The rustle of paper. The unmistakable small thumb flick of a man counting cash. Then Vincent Pell's voice, low and tight on a phone. Bradford. It's me. I'm in. There's about 200 in petty cash on the desk. I'm taking enough that they will notice. She's 73 years old. She'll think she miscounted. I just need a few more days. I have already been in his workshop. He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know who he is half the time. By the end of the week, I will have enough to give your lawyer everything she needs to file the petition. She is not running anything. He is the one with the legal interest in the property, and his mind is gone. We get him declared incompetent and the property reverts. That's all it takes. A pause. The sound of money being slid into a coat pocket. I will call you Friday. Click. Footsteps. The office door closing. Edward and Eleanor sat in the office in the silence after the tape ran out. Eleanor felt her hands shaking on the edge of the desk. But it was not the shaking of fear. It was the cold, steady shaking of a woman who has just been handed exactly the thing she came looking for. All right, Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. Edward reached over and put his old hand on top of hers. Mrs. Whitman, he said, I think it is time you told the rest of them. That evening at supper, with all of them, at the long table that Walter had built, Walter at the head, Eleanor at the foot, Delilah and Edward and Finn and Hollis Bramwell on one side, Henry and Samuel and Roland on the other, with Vincent in his usual chair next to Henry, eating his meatloaf with the small, careful smile he wore at every meal. Eleanor stood up. She set the cassette recorder on the table. She pressed play. For 3 minutes, nobody at the table moved. Vincent's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The color went out of his face in 3 stages, the way color goes out of a face when a man understands in real time that the room has just turned underneath him. When the tape ran out, Eleanor reached across the table and took the envelope from Vincent's coat pocket, which was hanging on the back of his chair. She opened it. She counted the bills inside. There were $140 in real money and $40 in play money from the board game. She set the play money on the table in front of him. That part is from a board game, Mr. Pell. You took it because you do not know what real money looks like when you are not the one earning it. Vincent did not say anything. He could not. His mouth had gone slack the way the mouth of a man goes slack when he understands he has been outplayed by someone he had badly underestimated. "You are going to leave," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. It was the voice she had used on a third grader who had stolen a classmate's lunch. "You are going to walk out the front door, and you are going to drive your Buick down the gravel road, and you are not going to come back. You may tell my son whatever you wish to tell him. I will be telling him myself in my own time." Vincent stood up. He did not look at anyone at the table. He went out into the corridor, and they heard the sound of the front door, and then the sound of the Buick starting, and then the sound of the gravel under the tires, and then he was gone. The table was very quiet. Eleanor sat back down. Walter was looking at her. He had been quiet through the whole thing. His eyes were clear. It was a good evening. He reached across the corner of the table and took her hand, and he held it the way he had held it on the night they had bought the jail, and he said in a voice that was steady and old and entirely his own, "Ellie, what in the hell did you just do?" "I bought us another week, Walter." He squeezed her hand. He did not let go for a long time. It was the next afternoon that Garrett came. Eleanor was at the kitchen window when she saw the black Mercedes turn off the county road and start up the gravel. She knew before the car was halfway up the road who it was. She had been waiting for him for 10 days. She had not let Delilah see her watching the road, but she had been watching it. She went out into the corridor. "Delilah," she said quietly, "go upstairs. Take the back stairs. Go to my cell. Stay there until I come for you." Delilah did not ask a question. The look on Eleanor's face was answer enough. She went. Eleanor walked to the front entrance. She picked up the long, heavy oak walking stick that Walter had carved for her birthday in 2018, the one with the worn, smooth grip and the iron tip. She held it the way a teacher holds a yardstick. Hollis Bramwell came up from the workshop at a fast walk. He had seen the Mercedes. He had been waiting for it too. He had a shotgun in his hands. It was a Remington pump action that had belonged to his father. It was loaded with birdshot. It was not a weapon that would kill a man, but it was a weapon that would make a man think twice, and Hollis knew the difference, and he stood 10 feet behind Eleanor on the front porch with the shotgun resting easy across his forearm. The Mercedes pulled into the turnaround. The engine cut. The door opened, and Garrett got out. He was a tall man in his early 30s, with the carefully maintained handsomeness of a man who paid attention to his appearance. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat. His hair was cut close. His eyes were a pale gray that did not warm when he smiled, which he did now, the small, smooth smile of a man who had been told all his life that his smile would get him through whatever came next. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, "I'm Garrett Pierce. I believe my wife has been staying here." "She has. I have come to take her home." "She is not going home." The smile did not move. The eyes shifted very slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am, that is not your decision to make. She is my wife. She is carrying my child. She is welcome to be angry with me. Couples have arguments, but she belongs at home with her family, not in—" He gestured at the building. "Whatever this is." Walter came out onto the porch behind Eleanor. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She could feel him there, the long, solid presence of him. He did not say anything. He stood beside her. "Mr. Pierce," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "I am 73 years old. I taught third grade in this county for 35 years. Do you know what 35 years of third grade teaches a woman?" He did not answer. He had not expected the question. "It teaches her how to spot a bully," Eleanor said. "I have stood in front of 35 Septembers worth of bullies, Mr. Pierce. The 8-year-old kind, the 30-year-old kind, the 47-year-old kind, the expensive kind, and the cheap kind, and every kind in between. There is not one of you that has ever been any harder to handle than the ones in my classroom. The only difference is that you are taller." She took a step toward him. She did not raise the walking stick. She did not need to. "Your wife is not coming with you. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not when she has the baby. Not after the baby. The next time you come up this gravel road, you will be coming up it with a court order, and you will be coming up it with a sheriff and the order, and the sheriff had better be very thoroughly papered, because I will be standing on this porch with a lawyer of my own. Are we clear, Mr. Pierce?" Garrett looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Hollis on the steps with the shotgun. He looked at Walter, who was standing in his work coat with the slow, steady gaze of a man who had built houses for 42 years and was not going to be moved off a porch he had earned. He looked back at Eleanor. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said quietly. "I know exactly who I am dealing with, Mr. Pierce. You are dealing with me." He got back in the Mercedes. He did not slam the door. He drove down the gravel road slowly, in the calm, controlled way of a man who wanted very badly to be seen as a man who did not need to slam doors. The dust rose behind him and settled, and the black car was gone. Eleanor went into the building. Walter followed her. Hollis lowered the shotgun. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said very softly, "Mrs. Whitman, that was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life." "Thank you, Hollis. You were not even raising your voice." "No, I was not." He nodded. He looked down the gravel road where the Mercedes had gone. "He will be back," Hollis said. "Yes," Eleanor said, "but he will not be back today." That night, Walter went missing. It was some time after midnight. Eleanor had been sleeping deeply for the first time in a week. She woke because the cold was wrong. She reached across the bed and Walter was not there, and the blankets on his side were turned back, and his coat was not on the hook by the door. She got up. She put on her shoes and her coat. She woke Hollis, who had taken to sleeping in one of the empty cells on bad nights in case he was needed. She woke Edward. They searched the building first, the corridor, the kitchen, the workshop, the exercise yard. Walter was not in any of them. "Truck is still here," Hollis said. "He went on foot." They split up. Hollis took the gravel road. Edward took the path through the back field. Eleanor took the old footpath that ran behind the building toward the small Methodist cemetery, half a mile across the field, where Walter's parents were buried, and where Walter's older brother, who had died of pneumonia in 1952 at the age of 16, was buried. She found him there. He was sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the cemetery in the dark, in the cold, in his coat that he had buttoned wrong. He did not look up when she approached. He was looking at the small line of 3 headstones, half visible in the moonlight. Eleanor sat down on the wall next to him. She did not say anything for a long time. She let the cold settle around them. She let him be. Finally, Walter spoke. His voice was thick. He had been crying the slow, private way a man of his generation cried, where he did not let his shoulders move. I could not remember how to get back Ellie. I know. I came out here because I wanted to see them, my folks. I knew the way out. I have known the way out my whole life. But standing here now, I cannot remember which way the road is. I am here. I will take you back. He did not move. Ellie. Walter. I am not the man you married. You are exactly the man I married. I cannot do the work anymore. Hollis is doing the work. I am calling cuts that he knows already. I have been calling them wrong for 2 days, and you have been telling Hollis to do them right after I leave the room. Yes. Yes. He turned to look at her in the moonlight. His face was very old. She had not seen it that old before. Why are you doing this, Ellie? Why are you not? Why have you not? He could not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Why have I not put you somewhere? She said. He nodded. Walter Whitman, she said. Listen to me. Are you listening? Yes. In the spring of 1978, when I was 25 years old and pregnant with Bradford, you came home from a job site one Friday evening with 3 2x6 boards and a sack of nails and a kerosene lantern, and you started building me a porch. You worked on that porch every Saturday for 11 weekends. You did it because I had said one time in passing in March that I missed my mother's porch in Lafayette. I remember. You built me a home for 54 years, Walter. You built it with your own hands. Now it is my turn. That is all. That is all that is happening here. I am doing what you taught me to do. I am building you a home. Do not tell me I should put you somewhere. There is no somewhere. There is only here. There is only us. He did not answer for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand. His hand was very cold. She took it in both of hers and held it. I am scared, Ellie, he said. I know. I do not want to forget you. You will not forget me, Walter. I will not let you. I will be the last thing you forget. They sat there in the cold for a long time. Then she helped him to his feet, and they walked back across the field together, the slow, careful walk of 2 people who had been walking together for 54 years and were not yet finished walking. Hollis met them halfway. He did not say anything. He just took Walter's other arm, and the 3 of them walked the last quarter mile to the building together, the building that used to be a jail, the building that had been waiting. They got Walter into bed. Eleanor sat with him until he was asleep. Then she went down to the kitchen, and she sat at the long table, and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She did not have time to cry. She sat there for 10 minutes, and then she stood up and she put on the coffee for the morning, and she went back to bed, and she lay next to Walter until the sun came up. The next 19 days were a blur. The list on the kitchen wall got shorter. The work got faster. Hollis brought in a younger man, a 36-year-old electrician named Booker, who finished what Henry had started on the 2nd floor. Samuel finished the upstairs plumbing and added a vent fan to the bathroom on Eleanor's prompting, because she had read the inspection requirements at the courthouse 3 times, and she had highlighted that line. Roland and a 50-year-old Finnish carpenter named Pace replaced the 7 panes of window glass and reinforced the handrail on the front steps. Walter came down to the workshop most mornings. On his good mornings, he sanded furniture. On his harder mornings, he sat in the corner and watched, and Finn brought him coffee, and Finn, who turned out to have the careful, patient hands of a boy who had learned early that quietness was a kind of safety, picked up a hand plane on the 18th day and began to learn how to use it under Walter's quiet guidance. By the morning of the 28th day, every item on the lists had been crossed off. The day before the inspection, Eleanor walked the building from the front entrance to the upstairs corridor. She walked it twice. She checked every smoke detector. She tested every light switch. She turned on every faucet. She opened and closed every window. She walked the fire escape. She walked the grounds. That night, she sat at the long kitchen table with all of them. There were 9 people at the table now: Eleanor and Walter, Delilah 6 months pregnant and nearly 7, Edward, Finn, Hollis, Roland, and Pace, who had brought their wives. The kitchen was warm. The wood stove was burning. Outside, the December wind was moving through the bars on the windows, and the long burgundy curtain Eleanor had hung on the first night was still there, still moving in the small draught. Walter was at the head of the table. It was a good night. He looked around the room slowly, and his eyes were clear, and he said in a voice that was the voice she had married 54 years ago, "Ellie, did I help?" She reached across and took his hand. "You called every cut, Walter. Every one." He nodded once. He did not let go of her hand for the rest of the meal. The inspector came at 9:15 the next morning. He arrived in a white state vehicle. He got out wearing a gray jacket and carrying a clipboard. His name was Patterson. He was somewhere in his middle 50s. He had thinning hair and a tight jaw, and Eleanor saw in the first 10 seconds of watching him cross the gravel turnaround that he had been instructed to fail this inspection. She knew the look. She had seen it on the faces of school administrators 35 times over the years, the look of a man who had been told to deliver a particular outcome, and who was trying very hard to believe he had arrived at the outcome on his own. Bradford had made a phone call. Bradford had connections in the county commissioner's office that went back 15 years. Bradford had not waited for Vincent to deliver evidence. Bradford had moved on to the inspection itself. Patterson came up the front steps. Eleanor met him at the door. She did not introduce Walter. She did not introduce anyone. She introduced only herself. "Mr. Patterson, I am Eleanor Whitman. Thank you for coming. Please, come inside." He came inside. She walked him through the building. She did not walk him through it the way Walter would have walked him through it, carpenter to inspector, foundation up. She walked him through it the way she had walked principals through her classroom for 35 years on the days before formal evaluations. She showed him the bones, but she showed him the children too. She showed him every cell, and at every cell she stopped, and she told him about the person who slept in it. This is Edward's room. Edward worked at Tipton Savings and Loan for 42 years. He sleeps here now because his wife died, and the medical bills took the house, and he was sleeping in his car at the Methodist Church for 3 months before he came up our gravel road on foot. This is Delilah's room. Delilah is 25. She is 6 months pregnant. She came up our gravel road in a car that was running on fumes, and she has been with us since the first week, and she is part of this house now. This is Finn's room. Finn is 17. His father told him to leave because of who Finn is, and we have not asked him any further questions because we do not need to. Patterson wrote on his clipboard. He did not look up at her. He kept his eyes on the work. But Eleanor watched him, and at the 3rd cell his pen had stopped moving, and at the 5th cell His jaw had started to soften, and at the seventh cell, when she stood with him in the doorway of Finn's room and showed him the small wooden hand plane on the shelf that Finn had been learning to use, she saw Patterson's eyes for 1/2 second fill. She did not say anything about it. She walked him to the workshop. She walked him to the kitchen. She walked him to the fire escape on the second floor that Walter had designed and Hollis had welded, and that was bolted into the limestone foundation with brackets a state inspector could safely bounce on. She watched him bounce on it. She watched him write. She walked him to the small office at the back of the booking room. There at the desk where the cassette recorder had caught Vincent Pell 10 days ago, she stopped and she said, "Mr. Patterson, I have one thing to ask you before you write your report." He looked at her. "My eldest son is named Bradford Whitman. He runs a commercial real estate development company in Indianapolis. He has been making phone calls about this property for 2 years. I do not know how many calls he has made to your office. I am not going to ask. I am only going to ask you one thing." She paused. Patterson's face did not move, but his pen had stopped. "My mother was in a nursing home for the last 4 years of her life," Eleanor said. "She did not speak the last 6 months of it. She did not know my face. I sat with her every Sunday for those last 6 months, and I held her hand, and I read to her from the books she used to read to me when I was a child." She paused again. "I am only going to ask you to do what is right by this building, Mr. Patterson. Not by my son, not by his phone calls, by the building. The building does not deserve to be condemned. It has been waiting for 60 years to be a home. It is a home now. Please write the report you would write if my son had never made a single call." Patterson looked at her for a long moment. He did not answer. He went back through the building. He spent another 40 minutes in it. He did not say anything else to her until he was standing on the front steps with his clipboard against his chest and the white state vehicle waiting at the bottom of the gravel. "Mrs. Whitman," he said. "Yes, I am going to file this report as conditionally compliant. There are 3 minor items I am noting for follow-up: a vent fan on the upstairs bath, a handrail on the exterior front steps, and a carbon monoxide detector by the wood stove. I will return in 14 days for the follow-up." He paused. "My mother passed last March," he said quietly. "I sat with her the last weeks. I read to her too." He nodded once. He went down the steps. He drove away. The follow-up 2 weeks later took 10 minutes. Patterson signed off and left. The newspaper article ran the following Sunday. Eleanor had not asked for it. A young reporter named Marion Whitley had come up the gravel road on a Tuesday, and Eleanor had not been able to think of a polite reason to send her away, and Marion had sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and listened. The article ran on the front page of the Millbrook County Herald the following weekend. By Tuesday, it had been picked up by the Indianapolis Star. By Friday, it was on the wire. Donations began to arrive, not the canned goods and the blankets that had come in November. Money, checks, envelopes from people Eleanor had never met in towns she had never been to. The total in the donations account by the 8th day after the article ran was $487,000. Bradford filed his petition on the 14th day after the article ran. A sheriff's deputy came up the gravel road at 3 in the afternoon. He had a sealed envelope. He handed it to Eleanor on the front steps. He did not stay. Eleanor took the envelope into the kitchen. She set it on the long table. She did not open it for an hour. She sat with it. She made a pot of tea. She poured 2 cups. She waited until Walter came in from the workshop. He came in at 4. He was on a good day. He sat down across from her and looked at the envelope. "What is it, Ellie?" "It is from Bradford," she said. "It is a court filing." She opened it. She read it. She read it twice very slowly, the way she had read the prescription bottle in the Pineview Motor Lodge 8 weeks ago. Bradford had filed for emergency conservatorship. He was petitioning the Marion County Probate Court to be appointed legal guardian of both of his parents. The grounds were Walter's diagnosed cognitive impairment, which the petition cited from Walter's own medical records that Bradford had somehow obtained. The petition further alleged that Eleanor was exploiting her cognitively impaired husband by operating an unlicensed residential facility under his name as the legal property owner, and that she was misappropriating the $487,000 in public donations that had been raised in association with the property. The petition asked the court to appoint Bradford as conservator and to freeze all donated funds in a trust under his sole control, pending a competency evaluation of both parents. The hearing was set for 21 days out. Eleanor folded the petition. She set it on the table. Walter was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window in a long slant the color of honey, and it lit the side of his face the way it had lit his face on the morning of their wedding day in 1972. "Ellie," he said. "Yes." "Are we going to fight him?" She reached across the table. She took his hand, the hand of a carpenter, the crooked left index finger that had not set right in 1981 because they had not been able to afford the time off, the calloused palm, the scarred knuckles, the hand she had held for 54 years. "Walter," she said, "we are going to fight him for both of us." He nodded once. He did not let go of her hand. Outside, the December wind was moving through the bars on the windows, and the long road from the courthouse to the gravel turnaround went on being a road, and the building that used to be a jail went on being something else, something that had a name now, and the name was home, and Bradford Edgar Whitman in his office in Indianapolis, in his black SUV in his wool overcoat, was about to find out exactly who he had underestimated. The lawyer who came up the gravel road 3 days after the petition was served was 33 years old and drove a small green Subaru that had a child's car seat in the back. She parked at the turnaround and got out wearing a charcoal coat and a pair of boots that had walked a great many courthouse hallways. She stood for a long minute looking at the building the way every visitor stood for a long minute looking at the building, and then she came up the steps. Eleanor met her at the door. The young woman set down her briefcase. She took off her gloves slowly. Her hands were shaking a little, but it was not the shaking of cold. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and then she said in a voice that was entirely different from the voice of a lawyer addressing a client, "Mrs. Whitman, I do not know if you remember me. My name is Adelaide Brennan. I was in your 3rd grade class at Millbrook Elementary in the spring of 2001. Eleanor looked at her. She did remember. She remembered a small blonde girl with a stutter and a habit of hiding behind her hair. She remembered a girl whose mother had died of breast cancer the previous October, and whose father had not been able to do much about anything afterward, and who had come to school in November in clothes that did not match with hair that had not been brushed, and who had stopped speaking out loud in class for a period of 7 weeks. Eleanor remembered the day the girl had finally spoken again. It was the 2nd week of February. They had been reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, going around the room a paragraph at a time. Eleanor had skipped Adelaide for 7 weeks because she had not wanted to put pressure on the silence. But on that February afternoon when the girl beside Adelaide had finished reading, Adelaide had taken a breath, and she had picked up the book, and she had read 3 sentences out loud in a small, clear voice, and the room had stayed perfectly still until she was done, because every child in that classroom had understood what was happening. Eleanor had written a letter to Adelaide that night. She had kept a copy of it the way she had kept copies of every letter she had ever written to a child who had needed one. "I remember you, Adelaide," Eleanor said. The young woman's eyes filled. She did not let the tears go. She set her shoulders the way a girl who had grown up too fast learns to set her shoulders. "I read the article in the Indianapolis Star," she said. "I have been an attorney for 6 years. I did 3 years in family law before I moved to elder law. I have read your son's petition. It is the worst piece of legal writing I have seen in a year, and I would like to represent you. I will not be charging you a fee." Eleanor looked at her. "Why?" she said. Adelaide swallowed. She straightened. "Because I still have the letter you wrote me, Mrs. Whitman. I have it in a frame on the wall of my office. I have looked at it every day for 25 years. The letter is the reason I am a lawyer." She paused. Her voice did not quite hold steady, but she did not look away. "You wrote that I was going to do something extraordinary with my life. I have not yet done it. I would like to start now." Eleanor stood in the doorway of the building she had bought for $6, and she looked at the young woman in the charcoal coat, and she thought of the small girl behind the hair in the spring of 2001, and she thought about all the things a teacher does not know in the moment she is doing them. She opened the door wider. "Come in, Adelaide. There is coffee." Theodore came home 4 days later. He had not been home in 3 years. He flew in from Seattle on a red-eye and rented a car at the Indianapolis airport at 6 in the morning, and he drove the 70 miles to Millbrook with the heater on too high and his hands tight on the wheel. He was 40 years old. He worked in software. He had not called his mother in 18 months, and he had not been able to tell anyone, not even himself, exactly why. He came up the gravel road just before 9. Eleanor was on the front porch. She had been waiting for him in the small, careful way a mother waits for a child who has not yet announced he is coming. He had emailed her the night before. The email had been 3 sentences long. She had read it 4 times. He got out of the rental car. He did not say anything. He walked up the steps. He stopped in front of her on the porch, and he was all of a sudden 8 years old again. The 8-year-old boy who had brought her a dandelion in a paper cup on Mother's Day in 1994. And his face went, and he put his arms around her, and he said the only thing he had been able to think to say on the long flight from Seattle. "Mom, I am so sorry." She held him. She held him for a long time. She did not say it was all right. She did not say anything at all. She had learned in 50 years of being a mother and 35 years of being a teacher that there were apologies that needed to be received in silence, because anything you said to fill the silence was a way of taking the apology back from the person who was offering it. When he could speak again, he stepped back. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I brought something, Dee," he said. He went to the rental car. He came back with a brown accordion folder. He sat down with her at the kitchen table, and he opened the folder, and he laid out in front of her 18 months of bank statements. "I have been sending money," he said, "every month, $2,000, to a joint checking account at Tipton Savings, the account that has Dad's name on it. I set it up the year I moved to Seattle. I told Bradford about it. I told Bradford to make sure you and Dad knew it was there." He turned the statements around so she could see them. The deposits were there, every month for 18 months. $2,000 from a Seattle routing number on the 1st of every month. The withdrawals were also there, every month for 18 months. $2,000 withdrawn within 48 hours of each deposit by a debit card that had been issued under the name of Bradford Edgar Whitman. Eleanor looked at the statements. She did not cry. She had stopped being surprised by what Bradford was capable of somewhere around the night Delilah had told her about the dinner in Indianapolis. But there was a small, cold place inside her that opened a little wider when she saw the line of $2,000 withdrawals stretching back across an entire calendar year and a half. "He closed the account 2 months ago," Theo said. "I got the notice. I called him. He said you and Dad had asked him to consolidate things into a different account because the bank was charging fees. I did not push him on it. I should have." He stopped. He looked at the statements on the kitchen table. "Mom, I am the youngest. I have been the youngest my whole life. I have always let Bradford handle things because Bradford was the one who handled things. I should have come home. I should have called. I should have done about 100 things that I did not do. I do not know how to fix it." Eleanor reached across the table. She put her hand on top of his. "Theodore," she said, "you came home now. That is what you can do. The rest of it we will figure out as we go." He nodded. He did not trust his voice. "Can I see Dad?" he said finally. "He is in the workshop," she said. "Go on. He is having a good day." Theo went out to the workshop. Eleanor stayed at the kitchen table with the bank statements in front of her. Adelaide, who had come up from the back hallway and had heard the last part of the conversation, came in and sat down across from her. Eleanor turned the bank statements toward her. "Counselor," Eleanor said, "how does this look?" Adelaide read the statements. She read them slowly. "Mrs. Whitman," she said, "this is not a misunderstanding. This is not bad family communication. This is a paper trail. If we can get the original signature card from Tipton Savings, and if the signatures on the withdrawal authorizations do not match your husband's actual signature, we are not in front of a probate judge anymore. We are in front of a prosecutor. Get the signature card." "I will." Marlene came home the day before the hearing. She came in a green Honda minivan with 2 children in the back seat, a 9-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. She parked at the turnaround. She sat in the van for a long time before she got out. Her son and daughter watched her from the back seat. She finally got out, and she helped them out, and she stood in the gravel holding both of their hands, and she walked up to the front steps where her mother was waiting. Eleanor came down the steps. She did not say anything yet. She knelt down slowly because her knees were getting harder for her in the cold, and she put her arms around her grandchildren and she held them. She had not held them in 3 years. The boy smelled like the same shampoo Marlene had used on him when he was a baby. The girl had grown 3 inches since the last photograph Eleanor had been sent. When Eleanor stood up, she looked at her daughter. Marlene was crying. She was crying in the way Eleanor remembered her crying when she was 11 years old and had broken a glass that had belonged to her grandmother, the long, quiet, shaking crying of a person who had been holding something inside for too long. "Mom," Marlene said, "I have something I have to give you. I have been carrying it for 34 years. She had a metal lockbox in her hands. It was an old document box, the kind that comes with a small key. The metal was scratched and dented. It looked like it had been hidden in the back of a closet for a long time. Marlene set it on the porch steps. She knelt down in front of it. The children stood quietly behind her. Marlene took a small key from her purse and she turned it in the lock and she opened the box. The box was full of paper. Eleanor knelt down beside her slowly, and she looked into the box, and her hand went very still on the edge of it. The papers in the box were letters. They were letters she recognized in handwriting. She recognized because the handwriting was her own. The letters were the carbon copies she had kept of every letter she had ever written to a struggling third grader over the course of 35 years. She had kept them in a wooden filing cabinet in the spare bedroom of the house on Barker Street, in a manila folder labeled Correspondence Students. She had checked the cabinet when they were packing for the Pine View, and the folder had not been there, and she had assumed she had moved it at some point and not remembered. It had been in this metal lockbox for 34 years. "Mom," Marlene said. Her voice was very small. "I was 8 years old. It was the spring of 1990. I came home from school, and I went into your room because I wanted to find my book, and the spare bedroom door was open, and the file drawer was open, and you had a stack of letters on the desk that you had been working on. I read the one on top. It was to a girl in your class named Marisol. The letter said you knew she was going to do extraordinary things in her life." Marlene stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I was your daughter. You had never written me a letter like that. I did not understand. I was 8 years old. I was jealous. I went back the next day when you were not home, and I took the whole folder, and I put it in this box, and I hid the box in the back of the cedar closet under my bed." She paused. She looked down at the letters. "I never told you. I never gave them back. I have been carrying this box from house to house for 34 years. I told myself 100 different stories about why I was going to keep it. None of them were true. The truth was that I took something that did not belong to me, and I did not know how to give it back without telling you what I had done." Eleanor looked at her daughter. She looked at the box. She looked at the careful copies of letters she had written on weekends over 35 years on lined paper at the kitchen table on Barker Street by lamplight in the careful printing she had used on every spelling test. "Marlene," she said, "why are you giving them to me now?" Marlene took a long breath. "Because 30 days ago I read the article in the Indianapolis Star," she said. "And I sat down at my kitchen table with this box, and I opened it for the first time in 20 years, and I read every letter." She paused. "There are 47 of them, Mom. 47 children. Some of them are from the late 70s. Some of them are from last year. I sat at my kitchen table and I read every letter, and I started to cry, and I could not stop crying for 2 days." She wiped her face again. "On the third day, I started looking them up, the names. I started searching for them on the internet, and I started calling around to old phone numbers, and I started writing emails to school district offices in Millbrook County. It took me 3 weeks. I have been doing nothing else." She looked up at Eleanor. "All 47 of them are alive, Mom. Every one of them. I found them all. I sent them a copy of the letter you wrote them, and I told them what was happening, and I told them about the hearing tomorrow." Her voice broke. "They are coming, Mom. All 47 of them. They are coming to court tomorrow. They are coming for you." Eleanor did not say anything for a long time. She looked at the box. She looked at her daughter. She looked at her grandchildren standing on the gravel in the cold, the boy with his hand on his sister's shoulder in the way an older brother stands. She picked up the lockbox slowly. She held it in her lap for a moment, the weight of 35 years of careful, patient teaching come home in a metal box. "Marlene," she said quietly, "bring the children inside. There is supper." The hearing was at 10 the next morning. The Marion County Probate Court was a marble building in downtown Indianapolis. Adelaide had filed their response 3 days earlier. She had served Bradford's attorney with the bank statements Theo had brought from Seattle and with the signature card from Tipton's Savings, which had been obtained the previous afternoon and which showed clearly that the signatures on the withdrawal authorizations on Walter's account for the last 18 months had not been Walter's signatures at all. Bradford's attorney had not yet responded. Eleanor and Walter arrived at the courthouse at 9:15. They came in Roland's old pickup. Hollis drove. Adelaide met them on the steps. Walter was wearing the navy suit he had been married in 54 years ago, which Eleanor had pressed and laid out the night before. The suit was a little large on him now. He had lost weight, but he stood up straight in it on the steps of the courthouse, and his eyes were clear, and Eleanor watched him and thought, "This is a good morning, please let it last until afternoon." They went inside. The courtroom was on the 3rd floor. It was an old room with high ceilings and dark wood. The judge's bench was at the far end. The petitioner's table was on the right. The respondent's table was on the left. There were maybe 40 seats for the public in long wooden pews like a church. Bradford was already at the petitioner's table. He was wearing a charcoal suit. He had 2 attorneys with him, one of them older, one of them younger, both of them wearing suits that cost more than the table they were sitting at. Bradford did not turn around when his parents came in. He kept his eyes on his papers. Eleanor and Walter took their seats at the respondent's table. Adelaide opened her briefcase. She laid out 3 folders. She did not look at Bradford. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Morgan. She had a steady face and a quiet voice, and Eleanor had asked Adelaide about her the day before, and Adelaide had said only she will listen. The hearing began. Bradford's lead attorney spoke first. He spoke for nearly an hour. He laid out the case for conservatorship the way a man lays out a deal at a dinner meeting. He cited Walter's medical records. He cited the $487,000 in donations. He cited the unlicensed nature of the residential operation. He cited a paragraph from the Indianapolis Star article in which Eleanor had said in her own words that she had no plan and was figuring it out as she went. He said the words mild cognitive impairment 17 times. He said the word elderly 9 times. He did not say his client's name was Bradford until 40 minutes in. When he finished, he sat down. Bradford did not look up. Adelaide stood. She did not have notes. She walked to the front of the room with her hands at her sides, and she stood for a moment looking at the judge, and then she said, "Your Honor, the petitioner has made the case that my clients are unable to make decisions for themselves. We are going to make a different case. We are going to call witnesses." She turned to the bailiff. "We call Hollis Bramwell." Hollis stood up from the 3rd row. He came forward. He took the oath. He sat down in the witness chair. He told the court he was 75 years old, retired from the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department, and that he had known Eleanor Whitman since the spring of 1982 when his 8-year-old son Daniel had been in her 3rd grade class. Adelaide asked him only one question. "Mr. Bramwell, when your son died in 1985, what did Mrs. Whitman do?" Hollis looked at Eleanor across the courtroom. He held her eyes for a long moment. "She came to the hospital," he said. His voice was rough. "She left her grocery cart in the aisle at the IGA when she got the news, and she drove straight there. She sat in the waiting room with my wife and me for 6 hours. She held my wife's hand when the doctor came out. She came back to the hospital every day for a week. She came to the funeral. And the spring after Daniel died, when my wife could not get out of bed in the mornings, Mrs. Whitman drove to our house every Saturday for 7 months and made breakfast in our kitchen and sat with my wife until she could eat. Hollis paused. Mrs. Whitman never asked us for anything. Not in 1985. Not since. He looked at the judge. I am here today because she did not need to do any of that. She did it because she was the kind of woman who did it. My son was 11 years old when he died. He had been in her classroom for 6 weeks. She acted like he was hers. The courtroom was very quiet. Adelaide sat down. Bradford's attorney waved off cross-examination. Hollis stepped down. Adelaide stood again. We call Edward Halloway. Edward came forward. He took the oath. He sat in the witness chair. He testified about his arrival at the jail in early December, about Eleanor's care of him, about the room she had given him, about the fact that he had been sleeping in his car for 3 months before he came up the gravel road, and that he was not sleeping in his car anymore. Adelaide called Delilah next. Delilah came forward in a blue maternity dress. She testified about the night her car had died on Hadley Road. She testified about the bruise on her jaw. She testified with her voice steady and her eyes on Adelaide and not on Bradford about the dinner 6 months ago in Indianapolis when she had heard Bradford Whitman discuss the property at $6 and the family-side arrangements he was going to make to clear the way. Bradford's attorney objected. The judge overruled the objection. Delilah finished her testimony. Adelaide called Finn. He came forward in a borrowed jacket that was a little too large for him. He testified that he was 17, that he had been put out of his father's house 3 months ago, and that he had been told by Mrs. Whitman on the morning he came up the gravel road that he was welcome in the building, and that no further questions would be asked of him. He testified that Mr. Whitman had been teaching him to use a hand plane, and that this was the first thing anyone had taught him to do that he had felt proud of since his father's house. Adelaide called Theo. Theo testified about the Tipton savings account. The bank statements were entered into evidence. The signature card was entered into evidence. The handwriting analyst Adelaide had retained a woman from the Indiana State Police lab who was sitting in the second row was identified for the record. Bradford's attorneys conferred quietly at their table. Bradford did not look up. Adelaide turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have one more witness before we call my clients. With the court's permission. The judge nodded. Adelaide turned to face the rear of the courtroom. Will the friends of Eleanor Whitman please rise? For a moment, nothing happened. Then in the back of the courtroom, a man stood up. He was in his early 50s in a suit. He stood quietly, his hands at his sides. Beside him, a woman stood. She was in her late 40s in a plain dark coat. Behind them, 2 more people stood, then 4, then 6. Eleanor turned in her seat. Walter beside her turned more slowly. He blinked. He did not understand at first. The pews behind them were filling, not just the back 2 pews where she and Adelaide had assumed Marlene's people would sit. The middle pews, the front pews. People were standing in the side aisles. A man was standing against the back wall. A woman in a wheelchair had been pushed up to the side. There were not 47 seats in the courtroom. There were fewer than that. There were people standing because there were not enough seats. Eleanor counted. Her hand was on Walter's arm. Walter was watching her face, not the room. She counted slowly the way she had counted children in her classroom on the first morning of every September. 47. Marlene was sitting in the second pew. Her 2 children were beside her. She was watching her mother's face, and she was crying quietly, and she did not look away. The judge looked at the room. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she looked at Adelaide. Counselor, will your witnesses please identify themselves for the record? Adelaide nodded once. She turned to the room. Will each of you please state your name and the year you were in Mrs. Whitman's third-grade class? Briefly, one sentence. The woman in the suit at the back spoke first. She had a steady, clear voice. She did not move from her place in the aisle. My name is Marisol Vance. I was in Mrs. Whitman's class in 1990. I am a pediatric oncologist at Riley Hospital. The man beside her. My name is Catherine Adair's husband, Patrick Adair. I am here with my wife, who was in Mrs. Whitman's class in 1986. She is a high school principal in Tipton. The woman beside him stepped forward. I am Catherine Adair, she said quietly. I am also here. A man in the third row. James Sutton. I was in Mrs. Whitman's class in 1978. I am a journeyman electrician. I served 11 years in the Indiana Department of Correction, starting in 1991, and Mrs. Whitman wrote me a letter when I was 8 years old that I have kept in my wallet for 47 years. Eleanor put her hand to her mouth. The voices kept coming. A woman in her 40s, 2 pews back, who was now a labor and delivery nurse at Methodist Hospital. A man in his 50s who had spent 20 years in the Marion County Sheriff's Department and had retired the previous June. A woman in her 30s who was a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, now in the same classroom where Eleanor had taught her. A man in his 60s who had become a structural engineer. A woman in her late 50s who ran a nonprofit in Bloomington that placed foster children in long-term homes. A man in the back row in a heavy canvas coat who said in a quiet, shaking voice that he was a master carpenter in Greenwood and that he had been homeless for 2 years in his late 20s and that the letter Mrs. Whitman had written him in 1987 had been folded inside his coat pocket the entire time. 47 of them. 47 names. 47 occupations. 47 lives that had begun in a classroom on the second floor of Millbrook Elementary School over the course of 35 Septembers. When the last of them had spoken, a young woman of 26, who was a social worker in Indianapolis, who had been in Eleanor's last class in the spring of 2013, the courtroom went very quiet. The judge looked down at her bench. She wrote something on a piece of paper. She did not look up for a long moment. Bradford had finally lifted his head. He was looking at the room. His face had the look of a man who had spent 20 years calculating with great precision and who was for the first time looking at a calculation he had not made. Adelaide turned to the bench. Your Honor, we call Walter Whitman. Walter stood up. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. She had not been sure he would be able to do this. They had talked about it the night before. Adelaide had said it did not have to happen. There were affidavits. There were doctor's letters. There were ways to make the case without putting Walter on the stand. Walter had said quietly at the kitchen table the night before, I will know if it is a good morning, Ellie. If it is a good morning, I am going to speak. It was a good morning. He walked to the witness chair slowly. He took the oath. He sat. He looked at the judge. He looked at Eleanor. He took a breath. My name is Walter Whitman, he said. I am 76 years old. I was a carpenter for 42 years in Millbrook County, Indiana. I have been married to Eleanor Whitman for 54 years. I have been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. My doctor tells me it will become worse. He is right. It is becoming worse. The courtroom was perfectly still. I knew this before my wife knew it, Walter said. I hid it from her for 6 months. I was wrong to do that. I was afraid. I was afraid of being a burden. I was afraid that the woman I had spent 54 years building a life with was going to look at me one day and see only the disease. I was wrong to be afraid of that. My wife has never once looked at me and seen only the disease. My wife has only ever looked at me and seen me. He paused. He looked at Bradford. Bradford did not look back. My eldest son has filed a petition saying that my wife is exploiting me, Walter said. I would like to address that. My wife is not exploiting me. My wife is the reason I am still in this world. She has built a home for me. She has built a home for the people who have come to our door. She has done it because she is the woman I married, and the woman I married does not know how to do anything else. If you take her away from me, you will not be saving me from her. You will be killing me. I want the court to understand that. You will be killing me. He looked back at the judge. My son is wrong, Your Honor. I know my own mind well enough to know that. Some days I do not know what year it is. I know who my wife is. That has not changed. That will not change. I would like the court to dismiss this petition. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Whitman, she said gently, thank you. Walter stepped down. He walked back to the respondent's table. He sat down beside Eleanor. He took her hand. His hand was warm. He did not let go. Adelaide stood one more time. We call Eleanor Whitman. Eleanor stood up. She had thought about what she would say for many hours over the past 3 weeks. She had written drafts on the back of grocery bags at the kitchen table. She had thrown them all away. In the end, she had decided she would say what came to her in the moment. She walked to the witness chair. She took the oath. She sat. She looked out at the room. She looked at the 47 faces in the pews. She looked at her daughter Marlene in the second row, holding her son's hand. She looked at Theo in the third row, his face wet. She looked at Bradford at the petitioner's table, who was still not looking up. She looked at Walter beside Adelaide, who was looking at her with an expression she had seen on his face 54 years ago at the front of a small church in Tipton County. She took a breath. Your Honor, she said, I did not build the house on Hadley Road. 35 years ago I planted seeds in a classroom. I did not know what would grow from any of them. I did not write those letters because I thought any of those children would ever come back to find me. I wrote them because that was the work. Now they have come back. They have come back to build the house with me. That is all that has happened here. That is all that is happening today. She paused. My son is in this room. He is my son. He will be my son until I am in the ground. I will not say a word against him in this court. The court has the bank statements. The court has the signature card. The court has what it needs. She paused again. Her voice did not break. She had not allowed it to break. I would like the court to understand one thing. If you grant my son's petition, if you appoint him conservator of my husband and of me, I will not be silent. I will not be moved off my land. I will not be moved off my building. I will not be moved off my husband's bedside. The 47 people in this room will not allow me to be moved. The town of Millbrook will not allow me to be moved. You will need to send the state police up that gravel road, Your Honor. I am asking you with respect not to make us go through that. She looked at the judge. Thank you for your time. That is all I have. She stepped down. She walked back to the respondent's table. Walter stood up as she approached, and he held her chair for her, and he sat down beside her, and he took her hand again, and the courtroom was very quiet. The judge looked at the room. She looked at Bradford. Bradford had not lifted his head in 20 minutes. The judge wrote on her bench for nearly 2 minutes. She read what she had written. She set down her pen. In the matter of the petition for emergency conservatorship filed by Bradford Edgar Whitman regarding Walter Edward Whitman and Eleanor Wendell Whitman, the court finds the following. She read clearly. She did not raise her voice. The petitioner has failed to demonstrate that either of the respondents lacks capacity to manage their own affairs. The respondents have offered in this hearing more cogent and dignified testimony regarding their circumstances than the petitioner has offered through counsel. The respondents are clearly competent to manage their own affairs and to direct the use of charitable funds raised in connection with their property. She paused. Further, the court has been provided by counsel for the respondents with banking records and a signature analysis indicating the systematic, unauthorized withdrawal of funds from a joint account belonging to Mr. Whitman over a period of 18 months by means of debit card transactions executed in the petitioner's name. The court has no jurisdiction to rule on these matters in this proceeding. The court will be referring the banking records and the signature analysis, along with a transcript of this hearing, to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office for review. Bradford's older attorney shifted in his chair. The petition is denied. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The courtroom did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, and they were not that kind of people. There was a long, quiet exhalation the way a room exhales when it has been holding its breath. The 47 stood to leave in small, respectful groups, and many of them came forward to the rail at the front of the courtroom, and Eleanor stood up slow on her tired knees, and she went to the rail and she greeted them. One by one, each by name. She had read the carbon copies of every letter the night before in the lockbox Marlene had given her, and she had written every name on a small index card, and she had put the cards in her coat pocket, but she did not need them. She remembered every one of them. She had remembered them all along. It was the last thing the disease ever was going to take from her, and she knew it. Bradford had left the courtroom by a side door. She did not see him go. She did not look for him. The morning of the verdict was in early February. Outside the courthouse, the sky was the same color it had been on the morning she had bought the jail. Cold pewter, the color of an Indiana winter that had not yet decided to give in to anything. She and Walter walked out of the courthouse together. A year went by. The building on Hadley Road went on being what it had been becoming. 22 people lived in it by the following December. Walter had good days and harder days. On the good days, he sat in the workshop and called the cuts while Finn made them, and Finn, who turned out to be the natural carpenter Walter had suspected he was, on the morning he picked up a hand plane, finished his GED in May, and started at Ivy Tech in the fall on a trade scholarship a local foundation had created in Walter's name without asking permission first. Delilah's daughter was born in March. They named her Lily. Hollis built her cradle. Walter sanded the rockers. Delilah began night classes that summer to become a nurse, and Eleanor watched the baby in the afternoons in the kitchen, and the baby's first word in October was a small, clear, unmistakable "Papa," and she said it to Walter, who was sitting at the kitchen table, and Walter looked up, and his eyes filled, and he held the baby on his lap for a long time, and Eleanor did not interrupt them. Edward died in his sleep in June. He was 82. He died in his cell in the bed Walter had built for him, with the small bookshelf above his head and the curtain Eleanor had hung across the window. They buried him in the Methodist cemetery, half a mile across the field, in a plot Hollis had purchased without telling Eleanor, next to Hollis's own plot, and next to Hollis's wife's plot, and next to Daniel Bramwell's small headstone that read 1973 to 1985. The whole household went to the burial, 41 of them by then, including the baby. Pastor Whitfield read the service. Walter stood beside Eleanor, holding her hand on a good morning. Hollis read a passage from the book of Ecclesiastes. He cried at the end of it. He did not apologize for crying. Marlene came to live in Millbrook the following spring. She rented a small house 6 miles from the gravel road. She brought the children. Philip Halsey, her husband, did not come with her. They had separated quietly in February. Marlene did not talk about it much. She drove out to the building 4 times a week. Her children began to call Walter Pa and Eleanor Mama, the way Lily called them, and Eleanor allowed it because she had decided she had earned it. Theo flew in 4 times a year from Seattle. He was learning slowly how to be the youngest in a different way. Bradford did not come back. Bradford lost his real estate license in April by the action of the Indiana Real Estate Commission on findings of fraud unrelated to the Hadley Road matter, which had ramified outward when the Marion County prosecutor began to look at his files. His wife filed for divorce in May. His firm dissolved in August. Eleanor heard about each of these things by way of the local papers, which a friend of Adelaide's clipped and sent. She read each clipping once. She did not save them. Then in October an envelope came. It was addressed to her in her son's handwriting. It had a return address in Lafayette where Bradford had moved. There was no phone number on the return address. Eleanor took the envelope. She walked out to the back porch. She sat down in her rocking chair. The porch was the porch Walter had built that summer, wrapping around the side of the building toward the garden. The afternoon light was coming through the bars on the windows of the first floor and through the morning glory vines that had climbed the bars all summer and were now drying down in the cool October light. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages. It was handwritten. The handwriting was unsteady in places, the handwriting of a man who had been writing slowly because he was choosing every word. She read it. She did not know when she finished it whether what was in it was true. She did not know whether Bradford had written it because he meant it, or because he had finally understood that there was nothing left for him to take. She would not know ever with certainty. Some things you do not get to know. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its creases. She slid it back into the envelope. She got up from the rocking chair. She walked through the kitchen and down the back hallway to the small office at the back of the booking room. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Marlene's metal lockbox was there. The lockbox that had held the 47 letters. Eleanor had kept it because Marlene had asked her to keep it. The box was empty now. It had been empty for a year. She placed Bradford's letter inside. She closed the box. She closed the drawer. She went back out to the porch. Walter was there now. He had come out of the workshop. He sat down in the rocking chair next to hers. It was a good afternoon. He looked at her, and his eyes were clear, and he reached for her hand. "Ellie," he said, "was that a letter?" "Yes." "From Bradford?" "Yes." "What did he say?" She thought about it for a moment. She watched the light through the morning glories. "He said he was sorry, Walter." Walter nodded slowly. "Are you going to write him back?" "Not today. Someday. Maybe someday." He nodded again. He did not press. He had never pressed. He held her hand. The wind moved through the dry vines on the bars. A car appeared at the end of the gravel road. It was a small Toyota 20 years old with a dent in the front fender. It came up the gravel slowly, carefully, the way a car comes up a road its driver has not driven before. It stopped at the turnaround. The doors opened. An old man and an old woman got out. He was perhaps 70 in a heavy coat. She was a few years younger with a small suitcase in one hand and her husband's elbow in the other. They stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the building. The old man's face had the expression Eleanor had once seen in her own husband's face on a November morning a long time ago. The expression of a man who is trying to figure out how he ended up here. Eleanor stood up from the rocker. Walter stood up beside her. He did not let go of her hand. She walked to the front steps with him. The old woman spoke first. Her voice was small. "We were going to be staying with our son in Indianapolis," she said. "But when we got there yesterday, the locks had been changed. He won't answer the phone. The pastor at the Methodist church told us about you." Eleanor looked at the old man. The old man's face had not moved. His eyes were on the doorway behind her, the doorway with the long brass school bell, the doorway with the small hand-painted sign over the lintel that read in Eleanor's careful printing, "All welcome." Walter stepped forward. He let go of Eleanor's hand. He went down the steps slowly. He took the suitcase from the old woman. He looked at the old man and he held out his hand. "I am Walter Whitman," he said. His voice was steady. "It was a good afternoon. It was a very good afternoon. This is my wife Eleanor. Come inside. There is coffee." He led them up the steps. Eleanor stood at the top of the steps on the porch of the building she had bought for $6 on the morning of the worst day of her life, and she watched her husband help two old strangers into the home she had built, and she thought about a lot of things. She thought about Cordelia Hartwell behind the records counter on the second floor of the courthouse, sliding a yellowed envelope across at her on the day she paid her $6. She thought about a small, quiet boy with a stutter who had loved books in 1978. She thought about a metal lockbox in the back of a cedar closet for 34 years. She thought about Walter on a low stone wall in a Methodist cemetery in the middle of the night asking her why she was not putting him somewhere, and herself answering, "You built me a home, Walter. Now it is my turn." She thought about the 47 of them rising in a courtroom in Indianapolis. She thought about her own mother, who had taught second grade for 31 years in Tipton County, and who had said to her on the porch of the Lafayette House in 1977, when Eleanor was 24 and pregnant with Bradford, and afraid you do not know what you are planting, child, you just plant it. She watched her husband disappear into the corridor with the old man's suitcase in his hand. She turned and looked at the porch. The wedding photograph from 1972 was on the small shelf by the door where she had set it that morning, the way she set it out every morning. Walter in the borrowed suit, herself in her mother's dress, the two of them grinning like they had already won. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she picked it up. She held it in both hands. "We were right about the only thing that mattered, Walter," she said quietly to the empty porch, to the morning glories on the bars, to the long gravel road that ran a mile back to the county highway and on into the rest of the world. She put the photograph back on the shelf. She walked into the building. The door behind her stayed open. It always was.